Please open the commission.
The Royal Commission is now in session. Please be seated.
I'd like to start by acknowledging the Whadjuk people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be present. Yes, Mr. Rosen.
Good morning, Commissioners. I appear with Mr Bolster, Ms Hill and Ms Bergen to assist the Royal Commission into aged care quality and safety. Commissioners, this is the fifth hearing of the Royal Commission, with the fourth hearing having just concluded in Broome last week. Commissioners, this week, in accordance with paragraph A of its terms of reference, the Royal Commission will continue its examination into the quality and safety of aged care services provided to Australians. As was the case in the Sydney hearing in May, the extent of substandard care being provided, including mistreatment and abuse, will be examined by means of two case studies selected from the many submissions the Royal Commission has received from the general public. I'll say a little more about the case studies presently. The case studies are relevant to and will help us to explore the particular themes of this 4.5-day hearing, being person-centred care and palliative care. By paragraph E of its terms of reference, the Royal Commission is required to inquire into how to ensure that aged care services are person-centred, including through allowing people to exercise greater choice, control and independence in relation to their care, and improving engagement with families and carers on care-related matters. Each aspect of paragraph E of the terms of reference will be the subject of evidence that will be called this week. Public submissions are, of course, an extremely important part of the Royal Commission's work. I repeat the call for the public to engage with the Commission via the public submission process. The staff of the Commission analyse each submission received and use that information to identify potential participants in the Commission's hearings, roundtables and community fora. The Royal Commission has received 4,564 submissions to date. The importance of person-centred care is demonstrated by it being raised in 37% of those submissions. In addition, end-of-life care, which we'll also examine this week, is raised in 27% of submissions. And finally, 33% of submissions raise independence, choice and control over care as concerns. Person-centred care. Person-centred care is an approach to care that is derived from the work of the American psychotherapist Carl Rogers and the English social psychologist and dementia expert Tom Kitwood. In his important 1997 book Dementia Reconsidered, The Person Comes First, and his work at the Bradford Dementia Group in the United Kingdom, Kitwood advocated a new culture of dementia care based around the idea of personhood, which he defined as a standing or status that is bestowed upon one human being by others in the context of relationship and social being. Commissioners, they're themes that run right through the evidence that you'll be hearing this week. Central to Kitwood's work is the idea that having dementia in itself does not entail a loss of personhood. And although Kitwood's work focused on dementia, the evidence this week will demonstrate that person-centred care is a philosophy that applies to all forms of care. More recently, others have built on Tom Kitwood's work by focusing on the importance of relationship-centred care. The importance of relationships in the provision of aged care is expected to be a recurring theme in this week's evidence. I want to say a little about what has been said in the hearing so far about person-centred care. The Commission has already heard from witnesses who say that person-centred care should be the foundation of all aged care. At its first hearing in Adelaide, Mr Ian Yates, AM, told the Commission that COTA, formerly known as the Council on the Ageing, of which he is the CEO, believes person-centred aged care is a community expectation. While person-centred care is a term we've heard a lot, there's no consensus on its exact meaning. The Royal Commission has already heard evidence from experts about what they see as the key features of person-centred care in aged care. In the first hearing in Adelaide, Associate Professor Edward Strivens, the President of the Australian and New Zealand Society of Geriatric Medicine, described person-centred care as recognising that a person receiving care is an individual with their own life story, culture, interests and beliefs, with care being individualised to meet their own unique situation, needs and goals. He also described the type of care as doing things with people, not to them. Ms Annie Butler, the National Secretary of the Australian Nurses and Midwifery Federation, described person-centred care as respecting and being responsive to the needs, preferences and values of care recipients. She described how this type of care enables partnerships between the person receiving care, their family and carers, which provide respect, emotional support and physical comfort. Ms Clairwyn Little from Uniting Care Australia characterised person-centred care as building the system around the person and not the other way around. She said that the aged care services offered in Australia can often be highly institutional rather than being responsive to the individual's need to engage in meaningful activity and to maintain personal relationships. Drawing a distinction between clinical and non-clinical needs, Professor Deborah Parker of the Australian College of Nursing emphasised the need for person-centred care to be about the whole experience and not just the clinical indicator experience. In the Sydney hearing, Professor Elizabeth Beattie of the School of Nursing at Queensland University of Technology told the Commission that person-centred care is built on reciprocal relationships, with dignity and respect being vital components. Reflecting on the work of Kitwood, Professor Beattie said that a person-centred philosophy of care values the essential self within each of us. And she explained that by using high-quality interpersonal communication, staff can build relationships with residents that affirm personhood by creating recognition, respect and trust. Professor Beattie also made the point that even where people are severely impaired or have very little communication, they can still share a moment of connection that gives life a quality that is very meaningful. This important observation will be reflected in the first of our case studies later today. Professor Joseph Ibrahim of Monash University, also during the Sydney hearing, identified the central tenets of person-centred care as respect, equality, feeling worthwhile and choice. And similarly, Associate Professor Stephen McFarlane, the Head of Clinical Services for the Dementia Centre at Hammond Care, told the Royal Commission at Sydney hearings that family involvement is vital to the care of people in residential aged care facilities. As Associate Professor McFarlane explained, families are often the main advocates for residents and have the detailed knowledge of the residents' past personality, their likes and dislikes, hobbies and occupational interests, with that knowledge being vital to the formulation of individualised management plans. Importantly, the Royal Commission has also heard from direct experience witnesses who put into their own words their experience of receiving care that was not person-centred. In the first Adelaide hearing, Mr Barry Anderson spoke of his wife Grace, who lives with dementia in the palliative care stage. When asked by people about how to care for Grace, his message for them was as follows, and I quote, "It's a fairly simple message actually, to walk in Grace's shoes, to recognise that she's had a rich past, that there's a present and that she has an evolving future." Mr Anderson's message is simple but powerful and practical. It really encapsulates what is meant by personhood, recognising a person's history, experience and unique identity. In Sydney, Ms Daryl Melchett described feeling that her wishes about her privacy are mostly disregarded. She said that staff at her aged care home continue to open the door to check on her at night, even though she's told them this disturbs her and she's unable to fall back asleep. Ms Merle Mitchell AM told the Royal Commission in Sydney that with the way the aged care system is currently structured, staff cannot implement compassionate person-centred care. She described slow eaters being harassed by staff to finish their food. And Ms Mitchell made the point that many older people just can't physically eat quickly. She sees people acquiescing, just saying, yes, I've finished, as they don't want to be a problem. Also in the Sydney hearing, Ms Arisha Dillam Dasanaiki described the experience of her mother in aged care. She told us about a manager referring to her mother in her mother's presence as demented and adding, she doesn't understand what we're saying. The Commission also heard in the Sydney hearings from providers whose model of dementia care aims to provide person-centred care. Ms Jennifer Lawrence of Brightwater described its model as being based on understanding the person. Representatives of Group Homes Australia talked about their small home environment where there are smells and sounds of home to help people feel humanised. They explained that their work has built a strong connection with the residents and they involve the residents in all aspects of running the home to give them a strong sense of purpose and meaning in their lives. The central role of the caring workforce will feature in this week's evidence. person-centred care and the current aged care system. We've heard in earlier hearings of some of the challenges of providing person-centred care in the current system. Professor Henry Brodati AO, who as noted earlier gave evidence in the Commission's Sydney hearings, observed that person-centred care aims to provide care for the person, not prioritise the task or the organisation. However, for reasons that you've already heard and that will be further explored in these hearings, this can be a challenge. Our aim this week is to lead evidence about how such challenges are currently being overcome and how our aged care system can be redesigned to make the provision of genuine personal and relationship-based care the norm and not the exception. In previous hearings, the Commission has heard of the challenges for the aged care workforce in delivering person-centred care within the time constraints under which they labour. In Adelaide Hearing 2, you heard about the importance of taking time with clients in the home care context. Rosemary Dale, who works in home care, told you that, and I quote, "You've still got to go slow because sometimes we're the only people care recipients see. They don't see, their families have gone, their partners have gone. We're the only people they see, so it's a slow process." You also heard that the pressures of time can be distressing for workers as well as for the older person. Heather Jackson said, and I quote, "And so we're on time clock and it can be quite distressing for myself trying to get the job done if the person is not quite right that day." You've also heard that continuity of staffing is important for delivering person-centred care, reinforcing the importance of building relationships. In Adelaide Hearing 2, Ms Ford from Southern Cross Care told the Royal Commission that, and I quote, "We know that is the number one thing that people want, is continuity of workers. They want a relationship. They want trust." The importance of continuity of staffing will be a topic that a number of witnesses will be asked about this week. We'll call evidence of a number of models that are aimed at ensuring that carers have the opportunity to build relationships with the older people for whom they care. Dignity of risk. The Royal Commission has heard of the need to balance safety and autonomy when providing person-centred care. In Sydney, Professor Ibrahim talked about the importance of what he called dignity of risk, which he described as the principle of allowing an individual the dignity afforded by risk-taking, with subsequent enhancement of personal growth and quality of life. Both Professor Ibrahim and Associate Professor McFarlane in the Sydney hearing, and Ms Patricia Sparrow, the CEO of Aged and Community Services Australia in the first hearing, have made the point that people in residential care are being cared for in a manner that does not have regard to the dignity of risk. Associate Professor McFarlane said that the current aged care standards emphasise safety at the expense of a quality aged care experience, which would allow people to take reasonably controlled risks to maximise their quality of life. Ms Lawrence of Brightwater and Mr Gavshon of Group Homes Australia in the Sydney hearing described the balancing act required by a provider to allow for the dignity of risk. Mr Gavshon gave the example of a resident who was going on daily walks around the local area. The provider discussed this with the family, who were comfortable that these walks were an important part of the resident's daily life, and there was a plan in place if she got lost. As Mr Gavshon described it, giving that opportunity and that independence will probably have a much bigger impact positively than taking it away from her. Last week in Broome, we heard about accepting risk in the context of providing culturally safe care. In responding to questions around risk in eating traditional foods such as goanna, Professor Leon Flicker AO noted that, and I quote, "Again, this is the sort of the risk-taking that people have all the time. Aboriginal people in remote communities often eat some traditional foods. It's not necessarily going to be, the goanna that they hunt isn't necessarily going to be certified as safe for human consumption, but again, that's such a traditional part of life of some of these small communities that it seems churlish by people interfering with it, frankly." End quote. In his statement, Professor Flicker noted that risks may include participation in important cultural practices whilst unwell, or allowing suboptimal personal care by untrained family members. These risks should be taken after appropriate consultation with the community and family members, he told us. The focus for the Commission: autonomy, relationships and the quality of life. Commissioners, there are clear themes emerging in this evidence to date. The importance of relationships, respecting the person's individuality and uniqueness, respect, dignity and trust. The Commission will hear more evidence about the key features of person-centred care throughout this week. Commissioners, you'll hear from a number of other witnesses about the importance of understanding and valuing the individual, acknowledging their identity and concept of personhood. We'll receive more evidence about the importance of respecting and recognising the autonomy of the individual. We'll hear about approaches which recognise self and identity as being pivotal to well-being. Later in the week, the Royal Commission will hear from Dr. Lisa Trigg, an internationally recognised expert in aged care policy design. Dr. Trigg, who's in the hearing room this morning and will be present throughout the week, and we're very grateful for that, will explain that relationship-centred care means that everyone involved in caring, including the resident, their families and care workers, should experience relationships that promote a sense of security, belonging, continuity, purpose, achievement and significance. This hearing will also examine person-centred care and relationship-based care through the lens of palliative care. That is, care that is provided to improve the quality of life of patients and their families facing life-threatening illness. Dr. Elizabeth Raymond, an experienced palliative care physician, will explain that the philosophy of palliative care is built upon person-centred care. However, she will add that palliative care extends the concept of person-centred care beyond the patient, as palliative care recognises a unit of care, usually composed of the person and their family and significant others. We'll also hear from aged care providers about the importance of building strong relationships between carers and staff and the older person who's been cared for. The model of care at Wintringham, where many residents do not have strong connections with family, is one where small communities of staff and residents are consciously created. Evidence will be led during the hearing about consumer-directed and consumer-centred care, the latter being an expression that is used in a number of Australian regulatory documents that have been produced by the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission. In a statement by Ms Janet Anderson, the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commissioner, she states that the terms consumer-centred care and person-centred care are essentially synonymous, and she refers to a definition of consumer-centred care as being care and services that are designed around an individual's needs, preferences and background. It includes a partnership between consumers and providers. Dr. Trigg, somewhat similarly, distinguishes between treating a person as a patient, as a consumer and as an individual. She describes different types of quality: organisation-focused, consumer-directed and relationship-centred. And as she will explain, consumer-directed quality is more transactional. Relationship-centred quality, on the other hand, values personhood and rights. And as will be demonstrated, these are important distinctions, and they're distinctions of substance, not just of nomenclature. The phrase person-centred care, it's appropriate at this juncture to pause and reflect on this term. At the Sydney hearing, Professor Brodati noted that when describing the principles of person-centred care, some people embrace the principles, but others merely pay lip service to them. He quoted Dawn Brooker, a leading researcher, who's written that, and I quote, "It's now PC, politically correct, to say that we do PC, person-centred care, in lowercase." This week you'll hear from at least one provider who prefers not to use the term person-centred and describes their model of care as relationship-based care, noting that the term person-centred care is overused in the industry and has lost its meaning. Brian Lipman, AM, the CEO of another provider, Wintringham, will tell you that, and I quote, "We don't use terms such as person-centred care. We treat all residents and clients as individuals, and as a starting point, when thinking about how to deliver aged care, we ask ourselves, how would we like to be treated when we're old and frail?" Commissioners, you may consider such an approach to be refreshing in its simplicity. We've noted that the Royal Commission's terms of reference require it to inquire into person-centred care. And while we will undoubtedly use the term during this hearing, our aim is really to get behind the label, person-centred care, and to explore models of care and approaches to care that genuinely provide quality of life for older people, show respect for the individual, respond to the needs of the whole person, and have regard to the importance of relationships that that individual has with their family, carers and community. This will be our focus during this hearing. what the Commission will hear in Perth. The hearing will commence with a case study to examine the experience of Ms Nolene Heusler. In September 2015, Ms Heusler secretly placed a video camera in the room in which her late father, Mr Clarence Heusler, lived at Mitcham Residential Care Facility in Adelaide, which was operated by Japara Healthcare Limited. To her great despair, the camera filmed her late father being physically assaulted and humiliated by his carers, and she complained to the facility manager about that. The case study will include evidence from Ms Heusler and a number of current and former employees of Japara, including its CEO, Andrew Sudholz. We will examine whether Japara and its employees engaged with Ms Heusler and her late father in a manner that could be described as person-centred in its response to the complaint, or whether it prioritised its own corporate interests and reputation. Commissioners, the 2017 review of national aged care quality regulatory processes undertaken by Ms Kate Carnell and Professor Ron Patterson, the report being in evidence as you're aware, which is considered best practice in the response of aged care providers to complaints by residents and their families. In their examination of best practice by aged care providers in responding to complaints about services, the authors of the report considered, and I quote, aged care providers with a genuine commitment to consumer-centred care and improvement recognise that mistakes happen and complaints matter. Rather than fear the consequences, they value learning from complaints and embrace open disclosure, apology and careful attention to analysing and rectifying problems. They went on, aged care providers as service businesses. They should expect from time to time that consumers or residents' expectations will not be met. How organisations react to residents' complaints is telling, they told us. In the first case study, the conduct of the operator of the facility where the late Clarence Heusler lived will be assessed against this standard. Innovative providers and care recipients. Commissioners, as you're well aware, the Royal Commission is required by its terms of reference to examine and report on examples of good practice and innovative models of delivering aged care services. On the second day of the hearing, a number of providers will give evidence about how they seek to provide person-centred aged care, with an emphasis on nurturing relationships. In some cases, you'll also hear evidence from clients or residents as well. Jason Burton, the head of Dementia Practice and Innovation with Alzheimer's WA, will explain that organisation's innovative work based on a care philosophy which sees dementia through the lived experience of the person experiencing a changed world due to their condition. Mr Burton will explain how Alzheimer's WA is seeking to implement the ideas of Tom Kitwood, under whom he studied in the United Kingdom. Mr Burton will tell the Commission that good quality of life is a measurable outcome of good person-centred care. You'll also hear from Alzheimer's WA about the importance of person-centred care being supported by the management and governing body of an organisation in order for it to be effectively implemented. The Royal Commission will hear from Ms EA, who's been given a pseudonym, about the experience that she and her partner have had accessing day respite care through Alzheimer's WA. Brian Lipman, the CEO of Wintringham, and Kate Rice, a manager with that organisation, will explain the approach of Wintringham, which provides aged care services to approximately 2,000 clients, the majority of whom were previously homeless. They will explain that the care model they employ is based on respect and the building of relationships, in particular the relationship between staff and residents. Mr Lipman will also discuss the approach that Wintringham takes to managing risk. He'll tell you that all people, whether elderly or not, should be able to make individual and personal choices about risk. A good example of relationship-based care will be provided by Kevin Chester, the husband of Marie, who's a resident in an aged care facility in New South Wales operated by Widden. Mr Chester, who lives near to his wife in a retirement community, will detail their experience of aged care, including the positive experience they've had at the Widden home. The Commission will hear from Mrs Chester's buddy, Carolyn Jupp, a staff member, who will explain the practical operation of relationship-based care in her day-to-day work at the home. The Commission will also hear from Widden's Chief Executive Officer, Chris Marmorellis, about the importance of leadership in providing relationship-based care. A theme that will emerge from this evidence about innovative approaches taken by some providers is that they strive to conform to what Tom Kitwood calls the caring organisation. For Kipwood, an organisation's ability to provide genuinely person-centred care relies heavily on the organisation employing the right people and looking after them. Employees who are themselves respected and cared for are more likely to respect and care for residents. Mr Lippman of Wintringham will explain how genuine, respectful relationships and a culture of admiration and respect for staff on the part of management contributes to Winthringham's high staff retention rates. He will explain the sense of purpose staff get from working in a model of care that prioritises relationships. This reflects evidence the Commission heard from Ms Dale, an aged care worker, in the second Adelaide hearing. She described what she called the magnificent Australians that she sees every day, and she told the Commission about a 93-year-old resident to whom she'd provided care for 12 years, and I quote, she said, "The family just loved myself and other carers that went in there. Palliative care towards the end brought her home. I went in on the morning that she passed away. They asked me, would you please, are you able just to give Mum a wipe down because she's passed? And I said, absolute pleasure. I went in there, the next door neighbour, ex-nurse, we did what we did for her, made her beautiful, and then I went to her funeral. That is from the beginning to the end. It's what I see and it's what makes me get up at 4:15 every morning to go to work." Ms Rice, manager at Wintringham, will explain that when she's recruiting new staff, she looks for people with the right attitude and relies on her gut feel informed by years in the industry. The newly employed staff are then trained and supported. In this regard, Commissioners, you may recall similar evidence given to the Sydney hearing by Ms O'Flaherty of aged care provider Glenview, that it recruits for kindness and trains for excellence. This also calls to mind the evidence given in Sydney by Associate Professor McFarlane. He told us, and I quote, "The demand to improve staff skills and experience must also be balanced with the need to hire on the basis of attitude and character. No amount of training produces kind and compassionate people. A person may hold a certificate 3 or 4, but that doesn't mean that they like older people or have a passion for empathising, caring for or relating to them. You can teach a person to provide good care. You can't teach them to enjoy caring for older people," he said. Matthew Moore, who you'll hear from, is the General Manager of Aged and Disability Services at the Institute for Urban Indigenous Health Limited in Queensland. The Institute provides community-controlled aged care services to over 1,800 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients with a staff of just under 100 across a vast geographical area. Mr Moore will explain his 27 years of involvement in community services and the implementation by the Institute of the philosophy of person-centred care. He'll identify 5 key values which underpin the provision of person-centred aged care: customer responsiveness, respect, quality, accountability and transparency. Themes that the Commission will hear through these innovative provider witnesses and other witnesses related to person-centred care include A, the importance of personal growth and re-ablement and supporting people to maintain function and capability; B, how person-centred care promotes quality of life; and C, the importance of strong governance and leadership to support organisations to deliver person-centred care. Commissioners, you'll hear from a number of direct experience witnesses. Anthony O'Donnell is 85 years of age and lives in residential care in Perth. He will share his insights from his experience of residential care, that there aren't enough carers on duty, that a carer's role is task-oriented and there's no continuity of staff. The requirements of residents fall by the wayside, he'll tell us. Mr O'Donnell will give evidence that he was motivated to contact the Royal Commission to give evidence, not for himself, but for those around him who aren't able to speak out, and for his children's generation and the generations to follow, so that, as he puts it, the whole standard of the whole concept of aged care is lifted. On Wednesday morning, Commissioners, we'll hear evidence from 4 women who work in aged care around Australia. Anna Unwin, a physiotherapist; Gai Whitford, a registered nurse who's working as an aged care provider; Paddy Houston, a personal care worker; and Emma Murphy, a registered nurse. Each will share with the Commission their experiences of delivering person-centred care in the current aged care system and what are the challenges that they face and what works well on a day-to-day basis. Valuing older people and rights. Because the aged care system doesn't exist in a vacuum, Commissioners, the hearing will explore the broader societal context in which aged care is delivered. It will explore the way older people are valued or undervalued in Australian society. In the Broome hearing, you'll recall the evidence about the value that is placed on older people in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, with elders memorably being described as our national treasures. Dr Kay Patterson AO, the Age Discrimination Commissioner, will provide evidence on Wednesday about ageism and attitudes towards older people in Australia. This is an issue the Royal Commission has heard briefly about before. In the first Adelaide hearing, Mr Yates said, and I quote, "The construction of the aged care sector in Australia, aged care institutions as we know them, has to some degree been an outcome of ageism. And the lack of priority attached to aged care in public policy terms is pretty unprecedented. That is a function," he told us, "of ageism, which is like sexism and racism embedded in many ways in which we all interact." Mr McCallum of National Seniors Australia told the Commission that abuse and neglect of care is the worst demonstration of a lack of respect for older people. The first case study that we will hear later today includes evidence that's a demonstration of that, Commissioners. Related to this, Dr Patterson will provide evidence about the importance of recognising the rights of older people, particularly older people in residential aged care. She'll note that while there's been a reference to rights in the Aged Care Act for many years, those references have not necessarily translated into practice. Dr Craig Sinclair's evidence will also address the importance of human rights as being fundamental to the concept of supported decision-making. Supported decision-making is a concept that's emerged from the disability rights movement and finds support in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with a Disability. He'll explain that supported decision-making provides for people with disabilities to have equal recognition before the law and stipulates that they should be supported to exercise their legal capacity. It is part of a shift away from decision-making in the best interests of a person to supporting them to make decisions, or where not possible, and substitute decision-making is required, making decisions that are consistent with the person's will, rights and preferences. Dr Sinclair will give evidence about the work that he's done in developing material for the aged care sector about supported decision-making. His evidence will also cover advanced care planning. In this regard, it's important to note that the Royal Commission has published on its website a background paper on advanced care planning in Australia. It's the fifth such background paper published by the Royal Commission, and as with the earlier papers, it does not represent a position of the Royal Commission's on the issues it covers. The paper's been prepared rather for the benefit of the Commissioners and the public, and it will be referred to at times during the hearing. Dr Sinclair's evidence also described the importance of people having choice in aged care and the loss of identity and learned helplessness that can result where a person is denied choice or control over their lifestyle. The evidence of Dr Mike Runge of the Global Centre for Modern Ageing will focus on the quality of life of people in the aged care system. Mr Runge will describe his many years of work for aged care provider the ACH Group and the work done there to measure the quality of life of its residents. He will distinguish between quality of life and quality of care. In particular, he will discuss the importance of reablement as part of residential aged care and the barriers that stand in the way of a proper focus on reablement and rehabilitation. Mr Runge will also talk about the losses a person can be expected to face when they enter residential aged care. Commissioners, you'll recall that you've already heard evidence about this experience of loss from the perspective of a person going into care. Ms Mitchell in Sydney explained that she felt an overwhelming sense of loss when she moved into aged care. She told us, and I quote, "The sense of loss that comes from moving to aged care is really underestimated. There's the loss of your privacy, the loss of your independence, and for me it was the fear of the loss of my community as well." Ms Mitchell also described the trauma associated with losing access to items like photo albums that were precious to her. She said that living in an aged care facility without her own things around her is not a proper life. Memorably, Commissioners, Ms Mitchell told you that the residential facility is where she lives, but it's not a home. Commissioners, in one short, sad sentence, Ms Mitchell sums up a lot about what this hearing will address. Palliative care. Palliative care will also be considered in this hearing. In this regard, we note that end-of-life care is listed as a mandatory matter for the Commission to have regard to under its terms of reference. An issue that will arise is the difference between end-of-life care on the one hand and palliative care on the other. Often the terms are used interchangeably in Australia. As a palliative care expert panel will explain to you on Thursday, end-of-life care is actually a narrower notion than palliative care. They're expected to say, that is the panel members, that end-of-life care is too limited and has a technical meaning under the aged care funding instrument, ACFI, whereas palliative care is the broader term that will generally be adopted during this hearing. On Thursday, we'll hear evidence in the second case study. Shannon Ruddock's father, she will tell the Commission, Vincent Parenthorne, passed away on 16 November 2017 at Calvary Hospital in Cogra, New South Wales. Prior to his admission to hospital, Mr Parenthorne had been a resident at Alkira Gardens, a residential aged care facility in the Sutherland Shire, New South Wales. Mr Parenthorne was referred to Calvary's community palliative care team in September 2017, and Joshua Cohen, who was at that time a transitional nursing practitioner. Ms Ruddock will give evidence to the Commission of her experience at this time about how, because of Alkira Gardens' failure to provide adequate palliative care for her father, the final weeks she had with her father were distressing and exhausting as she tried to ensure that her father was treated with dignity and received the care and attention that he deserved. As part of this case study, the Commission will hear evidence from Mr Cohen, the palliative care nursing practitioner, as well as a representative of Alkira Gardens. The Commission will hear, after we've concluded the case study, that approximately 160,000 Australians who die, of the 160,000 Australians who die each year, approximately 60,000 die in residential aged care facilities. Evidence will be led about the extent to which people accessing aged care services are able to access palliative care and the quality of palliative care services that's available to those people. Effective palliative care, you will hear, Commissioners, is founded on the concepts of person-centred and relationship-based care. And it's fundamental that a person's care in their final stage of life is centred on the preferences and specific needs of that person. As the Commission will hear from Dr Jane Fisher of Palliative Care Australia, palliative care is person and family-centred care with the primary goal to optimise the quality of life when living with a life-limiting condition. Dr Elizabeth Raymond, the Deputy Director of the Metro South Palliative Care Service in Brisbane, will give evidence as part of that panel of leading palliative care experts. Dr Raymond will explain, and I quote, "The philosophy of palliative care is built upon person-centred care. However, palliative care extends the concept of person-centred care beyond the patient, as palliative care recognises a unit of care, usually composed of the person and their family." Good palliative care also aligns with Dr Trigg's model of relationship-centred care. The Royal Commission will hear evidence that palliative care should include a collaborative decision-making approach involving the care recipient, family, clinicians and the provider. Respecting and harnessing relationships is paramount in ensuring a person has a good death, whatever that may be for that individual. Further to the focus on relationships in palliative care, the Commission will hear that good palliative care often extends into bereavement support for the family following the passing of their loved one. Palliative care was explored in Adelaide Hearing 1. The main issue identified was the unequal experience of palliative care services when accessed by aged care residents in comparison to the wider population. As Mr Nicholas Merciades, the Director of Aged Care at Catholic Health Australia, explained it, structural barriers exist in accessing palliative care services by a resident of an aged care facility, with the effect that the health system has proved to be varied and problematic in regard to palliative care services. Dr Raymond, who you'll hear from, will describe this as what she calls a form of postcode lottery. That is, where you live determines the access that you get to palliative care in aged care. The hearing will explore the various barriers to accessing palliative care. A key barrier to palliative care services is the shortage of staff with the required skill mix to provide palliative care in residential aged care facilities. This point was made by Dr Anthony Bartoni, the President of the Australian Medical Association, and Ms Butler from the Nursing Union in Adelaide Hearing 1. In addition, funding arrangements may impede access to palliative care. As Mr Yates and Ms Sparrow said in Adelaide Hearing 1, palliative care needs to be better integrated into aged care, and the Commonwealth state divide of funding contributes to diminished access to palliative care. In addition, you will hear that under the aged care funding instrument, funding is only available for the last week or days of a person's life. These issues will be ventilated in this hearing and explored in more detail in later hearings. Over the coming week, the Royal Commission will hear from a number of witnesses about palliative care. The Commission will hear from 2 witnesses about how palliative care is delivered at home and in the residential aged care facilities, respectively. Commissioners, you may recall in an Adelaide hearing one, Dr Bartoni of the AMA reflected that in general, older people would like to die at home. However, the aged care system doesn't appear to be geared towards palliative care being provided at home. This is one way palliative care services are not ordinarily aligned with an individual's preferences. In this regard, the Commission will hear this week from Ms Dale Fisher, the CEO of Silverchain. Silverchain is a provider of palliative care services at home, and Ms Fisher will explain why palliative care at home should be prioritised. She'll also describe how Silverchain aims to deliver palliative care that is centred on the needs of the person receiving care and their families. The Royal Commission will then hear from Mr Joshua Cohen, who's now a nurse practitioner at Calvary Hospital's Specialist Palliative Care Unit. Mr Cohen will give evidence about how Calvary Specialist Palliative Care Services operate to deliver palliative care in residential aged care facilities. He'll expand on what makes Calvary's outreach model successful and the challenges associated with delivering palliative care services in residential aged care. Finally, the Commission will hear from a panel consisting of Dr Jane Fisher of Palliative Care Australia, Professor Jennifer Tiemann of Flinders University and Dr Elizabeth Raymond of the Metro South Palliative Care Service in Queensland. Dr Fisher, Professor Tiemann and Dr Raymond will describe the policy considerations affecting palliative care and how to improve the accessibility of palliative care services within the aged care system. This panel will also give evidence about key policy initiatives in palliative care. The final witness to be called in this hearing will be Dr Lisa Trigg of Social Care in Wales, Great Britain. Social Care is a government-sponsored organisation aimed at providing social care, including aged care, in Wales. Dr Trigg has spent a number of years conducting international research into